Welcome back to another episode of the Breakneck Podcast. Matt and Ian are here with you. We are breaking down our perspective of building companies and building products with AI. I think our theme last week is the adoption of some of these products is not nearly as great. You know, you're paranoid feeling that you're late. And to that end, like, let's talk about what is actually going to take to scale up and for millions of people to use what maybe only tens or hundreds of thousands of people are actually engaging with is going to take a big change. So why don't you break it down, Ian?
Yeah, so I think you're leaning into hyperscalers, which
Why don't you define that? Because that's even for me, it's
I was
like,
hoping you wouldn't
is that
ask me
what's
that.
that? Google? Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to nod towards the fact that somebody picked this term hyperscalers, which is true Silicon Valley naming. You've taken something that is essentially infrastructure and made it sound cool. So that aside, I'm not going to define what hyperscalers are. I'll tell you who I think they are, and then we can maybe come up with a definition. So there's essentially globally, I think, six of them. And here's the sort of the cheat sheet on this, the cheat code. Cloud providers are now hyperscalers. That's essentially it. So, and it's broken up into two geographies. It's the US and China. I think Europe has kind of hamstrung themselves. Maybe they didn't have the resources anyway, but regulation hasn't helped. So let's list off the six. So we've got Microsoft, so Azure, we've got AWS, we've got Google, right, in the US. And then in China, we've got Tencent, we've got Alibaba, and we've got Baidu. I'm no expert in China. I'm probably going to talk or use examples of the US guys. And really what we're talking about is we've got these huge revenue generating businesses. In the case of Microsoft and AWS, about 100 billion or so a year. Google Cloud's a little bit smaller. I think it's about $40 billion a year. They're looking into the future, and they know, you know, to look that far into the future, and they're thinking AI is going to be the thing that's going to kind of keep the wheels spinning here. And what's interesting about it is they have different, you know, strengths and weaknesses and strategies. But let's maybe just take one of them as an example here. So let's take Microsoft. Azure is their cloud platform. We're probably more aware than ever of Azure because of the OpenAI partnership. And so what they've actually done from very early stage is realize these LLMs are going to power this revolution. They've built this very tight relationship, which is embedded both in Azure as a cloud platform, but also the business and the consumer applications that we're all familiar with. So they've done this sort of vertical integration approach. They make, as I said, about $100 billion in revenue a year. They're investing somewhere around $25-26 billion in R&D every year. So close to 30%, which is pretty amazing. So let's contrast that against a couple of the other ones. Amazon is about a similar size, $100 billion. They're doing 15 in R&D, so not exactly the same scale, but it's also a little bit opaque. A couple of interesting things from their perspective. Where Microsoft has the OpenAI partnership, so they've got access to that core LLM. AWS doesn't have that, right? They do have a Nova, which are not particularly powerful and not really very well known. So they're sort of at a disadvantage from an LLM perspective, ownership of
And
kind
they
of
and
that.
they have a deeper partnership with Anthropic, or maybe that's me imagining
They
that.
have, so theirs is more of a marketplace strategy. If you look at their platform, they have Ability AI, for example, as well as Claude and a bunch of other ones. Now, the other thing that's interesting about all three of the folks is custom silicon. So AWS has their own custom silicon. I forgot to mention that on the Microsoft side. And as we jump across Google Cloud, the little brother of them all, 40 billion in revenue, the advantage that Google folks have in the Google Cloud is really this kind of prowess when it comes to AI, right? They've got Gemini, they've got everything they need. They're also coming from a sort of a little bit of a disadvantage, and then they're more consumer focused. So when they're trying to do this vertical integration of silicon and cloud compute all the way up to consumer applications or business applications, they're not quite as strong in the enterprise application space. So there's a brief characterization of what they're doing. We still haven't done a definition. Matt, do you want to attempt a definition of what a hyperscaler
It
actually
just it
is?
just has to be they own a lot of servers. It's just infrastructure. They own a lot of servers, and they're investing a huge amount of money in dominating servers. But also, I think, yeah, there's this like, is there a differentiation? I think probably AWS has the least R&D relative to their revenue because they have the best market position. They don't need to defend, or they don't need to be aggressive and try to open up new markets. I think that's why Microsoft had to invest so much in OpenAI. They put tens of billions of dollars into that, I'm sure, one way or another. And Google as well, because Google is a distant second, and then they got beat by Azure. GCP has been around forever. I remember I was like 2011. I built my first thing out of grad school. I built a Python app on GCP, or it was GAE, is Google App Engine is what they called it back then.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they've always just not gotten the right mix. Where Amazon had the Web 2.0 API driven, and they had these kind of modular components of EC2 and things like that. So I think Amazon is the market leader by far. Microsoft has such a strong enterprise base, and that's the same way they killed Slack. Teams is a far inferior product. I don't use Teams, but from what people say, it seems as bad as it seems at the outset. But the fact that they had 300 million people they could deploy it to instantly. And I think that's what they've done with Azure. Is like they know that they can be second for a while and still eventually catch up just on the strength of how many business relationships. Google has been the AI leader since the beginning. And I think Google has TPUs. You're talking about custom silicon. They've been developing their TPUs for many generations now. But Google's bad at doing enterprise. They're bad at being modular. They're bad at having platforms. It's too messy of a company, but it seems like they've really made a lot of progress and they basically hit the frontier in terms of cost and performance. They own the frontier, and the founders coming back in and putting a lot of effort at probably kind of untangling what would be a normally pretty complex internal political environment in Google. Seems like they might be making a lot of progress these days.
So I cast it as sort of an infrastructure play, but that's almost definitely underplaying what's at stake here. What do you think? What's the prize here? What are they trying to achieve? It feels to me like there may be
Well, in
multiple
terms
goals.
of cash flow and profit, AWS is so much better of a business than Amazon. And in fact, when you work with AWS, they would like you to call it AWS and not call them Amazon, because it's very likely that that will get split off as a separate business if antitrust comes after them. I think Trump getting elected probably makes that much less likely, but AWS is one of the best businesses in the world in terms of how well it's scaled, in terms of its relevance.
In terms of margins, yeah.
Um, the margins, but they owned Web 2.0. They owned API driven web. And I think that's most of what got built on Amazon. So the worry for Amazon, or for AWS, excuse me, is that AI is going to be so disruptive of a change that they don't accrue the benefits of those development environments and the existing software products that are already deployed. And someone says, well, I have everything on AWS, but this is an AI product. So I'm just going to go build it with OpenAI, or I'm going to go build it with Gemini. And ironically, Microsoft invested in OpenAI. Their first target was Google. They wanted to disrupt Google's search monopoly, I think primarily. Microsoft was, really trying to get into consumer, but now the fight has overflowed into enterprise substantially, and now AWS is now a part of this fracas.
AWS really does fit into that mold of that category of infrastructure. I think let's introduce vertical integration as a loose term for owning kind of multiple layers of the stack. Google and Microsoft already own multiple layers of the stack. And let's bring OpenAI into the mix a little bit here, right? Because we talked about the Johnny Ive acquisition, which kind of opens up the aperture on kind of what OpenAI is up to, right? They're talking about potentially having devices all the way down to their own data centers. I know they rely on Microsoft data centers a lot. So what's at play potentially here is not just let me own the new version of infrastructure, which is kind of AWS. There's I don't know if it's efficiencies in owning that stack or what the interest is really there. It's just just more margin ultimately. But it seems to me that both Google and Microsoft and OpenAI are placed quite well to be much more vertically integrated than AWS.
What are the real opportunities for vertical integration? The when we take on the topic of vertical integrations, that there's the ability, in my mind, to make large scale supply chain changes very quickly is the main reason you want to do it. Not for actually getting margin. Margin is hard to defend. So if you're just capturing margin and you do a huge capital outlay to capture margin, and then somebody else does the same thing, well, now you've just wasted a bunch of capital. to own the entire supply chain, and then what do you get for it? So I think a lot of companies will tolerate their suppliers and vendors having more margin unless there's the ability to go make transformational changes that incorporate the entire vertically integrated stack into a new way of doing things. And I think that's what AI represents, is that if, for instance, custom silicon can be designed in a way that it makes it work much better on a model you own, which then gives you a unique and differentiated product. Well, it's if those were each of those three layers, the silicon, the model, and then the business application environment, if they're all kind of like unrelated and just exist in a marketplace, doing a whole bunch of work and to acquire all of those elements and create them internally is just very expensive. It doesn't give you a huge advantage. On the other hand, if you can, and I think you can bring up Apple in this situation, if you can have silicon that works 5 times better with this very particular way you're doing AI, which thus enables, for instance, on-device AI that has very different um, properties. Apple could own a vertically integrated silicon to application layer that is maybe optimized so that it runs locally and without internet and can have security features. Well, that's a unique differentiated offering which can sustain itself and sustain those margins that you've incorporated into that supply chain indefinitely. And so that makes sense as a vertical integration. If it's just, well, we need each layer of the stack, I think people are kind of setting out like I need to have some ability to eventually vertically integrate if I see the opportunity. But right now, GPUs are a commodity, but NVIDIA is just supply constrained, so they're doing very well. But there's no reason other people couldn't build equivalent GPUs. It's not like there's some special relationship between GPU design and model design. And similarly, models all are converging on the exact same set of capabilities and the exact same training sets. And so until we see different possibilities for models and different possibilities for silicon, and then the application layer is not mature yet. So why would you go put a huge amount of effort? And so I like Microsoft strategy. It's just buy from NVIDIA, buy from OpenAI, and then maintain your much more durable business relationships until you see exactly what it is, and then go spend exactly as much as you need to be relevant. That's my thoughts on
Yeah, I
vertical
mean,
integration.
yeah, it makes sense. Vertical integrations is often about efficiency, but you don't want to find efficiency unless you know that really there is application for that efficiency. And so,
I tend to disagree. I think
okay.
acquiring your supply chain just to acquire those margins and to make up your efficiency isn't a good reason to do it. Like use the example of Tesla. Tesla's like the most famous. Tesla and SpaceX, for instance, are the most famous vertical integrations recently, right? Um, in one case, building they have these gigafactories which replace these extended supply chains in the Midwest of brake suppliers and muffler suppliers and all this stuff. And what it gave them to be able to do, put it all in one factory, is to allow each phase of the design process at different elements, your brake design influencing your batteries and doing regenerative stuff and having all of your like for instance, like the average car has like miles of wires and like dozens of computers, and like the new Teslas have maybe like 1 or 2 kilometers, like 10x less, and 10x less computers because they all work on a common data standard and the same microcontroller standard, right? So those are the big things that you'd want to do vertical integration. So you could get rid of huge amounts of overhead that are just cruft from the supply chain being very slow moving, and you're able to vertically integrate and make those big changes. And I think if you just acquire margin, you pay for margin. Right? If you acquire
Yeah,
somebody's
I guess
profitable business, you're going to pay for that.
I'm saying, yeah, we're saying the same thing. I'm talking, that's what I mean by efficiency, not just margin, right?
Mhm.
It's efficiency slash control. But just to take the Tesla example a little bit further, if you didn't know if you were designing a four-wheel Tesla or a three-wheel Tesla, there's not a lot of point in doing a whole lot of vertical integration. Flexibility is a lot more important at that point. So we go to OpenAI, for example. Which one did they acquire, Cursor or the other one?
Windsurf.
Windsurf.
Yeah.
That's interesting to me, right? Because we have enough history now to go, no, this application is really, really working. So perhaps vertical integration begins to make sense. Probably not an efficiency. That's probably a control play more than anything else.
But you can
Um,
easily imagine how Codex is going to maybe have much deeper and more performant expression within Windsurf, who gets maybe another year ahead of time look at the deepest research, and they start to use the windsurf data on what people are actually coding with to fine tune certain parts of the pre-training process and stuff. So it's like I can imagine that having those R&D processes heavily coupled internally can produce a differentiated product in the long term that is better than anyone else can do because they have a lot of consumer data as well as influence on those base models versus a cursor who's using Claude or OpenAI or Gemini.
Okay, let's go back to the hyperscalers then. So we kind of dove pretty deep on AWS. Let's talk about Microsoft and Google, who are more alike, I suppose. What's at stake for those guys, right? Infrastructure, yeah. Are we going to see this sort of open AI model then of vertical integration, particular spaces that they already have expertise? I mean, we're kind of seeing that already, right? We're
Yeah, and
seeing.
let's back to the topic of the podcast. I think eventually the application layer will emerge, and companies like Google and Microsoft will have these embedded advantages of huge go-to-market functions, huge customer bases, the access to developing the core models, and hopefully, and this is I think where venture capitalists are investing, is they're going to go on an acquisition spree to take the best versions of each product and acquire them, and maybe we'll see something. This is what I say when I'm pitching VCs, is like, hey, go look at Cursor or Windsurf. Look what just happened for them. Cursor stayed independent, is worth $10 billion. The second place, or maybe distant second, was Windsurf, got a $3 billion acquisition. And GitHub already was an acquisition for Microsoft, so maybe Google needs a version two. If there's a race to see who can develop the mature application stack, maybe you just get a whole bunch of acquisitions. And can you position your startup to be a critical component of the application stack? And there's a lot of companies that are going out and building kind of fundamental technologies. Here's the new data lake for AI, or here's the new transaction bus. I don't know. There's all these little technologically that you might want to acquire that will be complementary to the LLM fundamental research and all of the capacity to deploy it on servers and things like that. But then also, will they want to start doing vertical integration of the application layer as well? And I think that's something I think about a lot. It's like, could you own a significant, interesting thing that couldn't have existed before AI that now does exist and could, whoever gets it wins. So I think it's really good to think about these hyperscalers as the fact that there's many of them, that they do have an advantage for vertical integration. And then from my perspective, that they can acquire big parts of the application stack and try to create this kind of comprehensive offering based on top of AI as things start to become more clear.
And where does that leave their secondary competitor, secondary level? So the platform guys, you mentioned Salesforce. We haven't talked about Facebook. You could throw Workday in there. There's a bunch of big platform folks out there that are kind of playing around. They don't have the core models, with the exception maybe of Facebook. At least they don't have core models that are of similar value. Are we just going to see all this value accrue and all these assets get sucked into these three hyperscalers? And is that why we need to be talking about them, or is
And
there
I
an
think
option?
it really does come down to if there are durable advantages for vertical integration, or if these things tend to create just three separate layers of commodity. I mean, if you're just buying GPUs, eventually maybe the GPU drought gets over and we have huge oversupply because they built, I mean, outside of Texas, they're building like a $40 billion Samsung factory. Like maybe we just have more chips than we need at some point. Okay, that's that all those H100s that you bought and all those data centers that you built out, and then suddenly maybe aren't the strategic differentiator. You can still maybe operate them profitably, maybe not, but it's not going to be something where you're going to have the ability to twist people's arms and say, you do what we want, or you can't get access to these GPUs the way I think some people can now. And similarly, if LLMs continue to become more diverse and have like all these different abilities, maybe having like a very tight coupling between your silicon, your way of deploying it, your memory structure, your inner server, inner data center connectivity, and how that all works, and you're doing deep optimization between the LLMs and the way that you're doing, say for instance, you know, runtime or the inference, the post inference to produce result. All that's super coupled together, your energy management, your bandwidth, all that stuff. If that's all tightly coupled, then yeah, then maybe having a control of your own LLM is going to be critical in the only way that you could ever stay relevant. Or maybe it's just become something where it's like, no, the models get cheaper and cheaper to operate all the time. They don't use compute nearly as much as they get all these efficiencies. You saw DeepSeek release that R1 in December. It was just like 10x more compute efficient. Well, that continues to happen, then you might reach a level where the ability to deploy these on gigantic servers isn't a constraint anymore. And similarly, LLMs become a commodity as well. And I think that's possible. And I think if you're Microsoft and you have this gigantic empire, you're going to go spend couple $100 billion to make sure that if it is true that super tight coupling between application intelligence and you're hyperscaling your servers, if that's super important, you continue to exist as a going concern and you protect your $3 trillion of enterprise value. If it's not there, okay, we wasted a couple $100 billion that we didn't need to, but we still are just fine anyway, and we're at the leading edge of these commodity products. That's that's how I tend to think about how these investments are being made right now.
So, Matt, we talked deeply now about vertical integration. I'm getting the sense, and you alluded to already, that these big guys, they've got big things to do, and the application layer is kind of the last layer that they're going to get to in real depth. So you painted a rosy picture for entrepreneurs. Are particular spaces that we should be focusing on as entrepreneurs? Tell me more about that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's how I position my company. Is that it is a way of operating companies with AI that is necessary and distinct from what comes for, and also has good network effects. I think like that's your basic like how can you build a defensible, scalable business? It has to be data driven, repeatable, but also have network effects and moat that once your thing is established. And so you look at like kind of communication protocols. I think the worry though is what happens if AI is just so good at everything that your particular application gets consumed. So I think two things I would look for is don't build something that an AI is about to get good at. Like, oh, we're a product that helps do better OCR. It's like being 5% on OCR, optical character recognition, is probably just a complete losing battle in the face of these multimodal models. So it's like you don't want to do that. And you also don't want to build something that could have been built before AI. I think that's a critical thing. Even if it hasn't been built yet, you need to focus only on the things that are going to have an absolutely brand new opportunity in the market when AI makes it possible, whether it's AI makes it easier to distribute, it makes it possible to build, AI makes it easier to scale, or even like we talked about, AI makes it possible for people to even think it's okay to buy a tool like this, which is really changing. You know, people are saying, "Oh, I'm ready to buy an AI project manager," is really helping our company. So, I think make sure you're adopting AI into your product. Make sure it's something that isn't possible with AI, and make sure it's something AI is not going to be able to do. And the general test there is, are you excited for AI to get 3 times better because you're just at the edge of your product barely working, and now suddenly it's working pretty well? That's got to be a test for you that you take every day. But then if it is, man, if there's some value to vertical integration of these different hyperscalers, there's going to be a lot of acquisitive pressure. There's going to be a lot of people who want to just build a complete, and you might get lucky. And so venture capitalists are going to see that it'll be easy to raise money. It might be easier to get acquired by a second place, even if you don't get acquired by the leader. Or it might be possible that you really have a durable advantage and you can build your own independent company and maybe, IPO and things like that. So I think it has to be a consideration. I think it's really important as you're building product to really understand the dynamics that are going to drive both adoption and then acquisition of your product. Like, is this financially a good idea for you to be working on? Is a question every entrepreneur and product manager should be asking.
Yeah, I think my rubric would, well, actually, let's go back to last week just to remind folks, we still think there's huge opportunity. If you're stepping in today, you're not too late. There is tremendous opportunity. We're still very much at the leading edge of a bunch of stuff, and I think we'll be for another good period of time.
No,
So
and,
not
and I
too late
think
to get involved.
AI might even be entering this perfect spot where it doesn't run away and you just have like 5 years or 3 years to like kind of make some effort before AI might be entering. And like, Apple released a report this week that AI isn't as smart as it thinks it is. And I have I, I have a trouble interpreting that. But let's say that we do enter a zone where AI kind of brings all these crazy new capabilities, but it kind of just it doesn't explode away and have that super intelligence, but it kind of just becomes, like you said, normal technology. And we kind of have already gone through this gulch of it wasn't fun to be an entrepreneur in 2023, maybe. So you've thinned out the ranks. There's less competition from dozens of products being funded to do the same thing. And then there's this new opportunity for a huge spurt of, if companies are spending $100 billion a year on AI, what does it cost to acquire 5 or 6 applications or 10 applications for billions? So that really does create some liquidity in the venture market as well.
Well, and it's not just venture. backed opportunity. There's opportunity everywhere. So I'm pretty sure now. I don't know. You can build sustainable businesses for a long period of time, but there's going to be roll up opportunities. So if you can get yourself 5, 10 reasonably sized customers in a particular space in the next 6 to 12 months, maybe that's when you pick up the money, right? So it's a lot easier to get there. But I want to go back actually just to my rubric for a second for people, which is kind of like yours. There's two spaces to play here. One is, and it's particularly good if you have expertise in an industry and you understand it, you can see opportunity and you can manifest a product and a business pretty quickly. So that's talking about, improving some existing type of a process. If you understand that space today, then you have advantage. There's ready access to the technology. So that would be one place to play. And then the other is this whole re-architecting of the way we things do. It's like if this, then that. If I can do this, then I don't need to do that. And actually, this is the type of thing we should be doing. Now, they're much more speculative, but there's huge opportunity there still. And I think probably every 90 days, we kind of have another set of opportunities as a some upgrade in terms of the technologies that are out there. So that's kind of the two paths that I would think about. But to kind of distill what you said down into one thing, whatever you pick, it better be fucking hard to do today. It better be hard to do. If it's
Yeah, it's
not
just
hard, don't bother because it's going to be
you
done in
you
90 days.
you feel this gravity as you're trying to sell and you're trying to pitch or raising money. It's just that you got to talk about the very hard thing and make that your goal, and also just gets so much easier to build things.
Yeah. Okay. So let's begin to wrap it up. We usually try and wrap it up with an interesting thing that we saw. You stole my thunder. You mentioned the Apple paper. So Apple did this paper on the deep learning models. They tell you what they're thinking, and then they give you an answer. And I have to admit, I have not read the paper. The summaries that I read were essentially what Apple says is it gives you this sort of series of thought steps along the way, which it makes up, and then it just makes up an answer independent of that thought theory. Interesting. I need to read it myself. I don't know if you have, Matt.
I have not. I got it forwarded to me, and I was like, I'm on a plane. I'm not going to read this paper right now, but I did read a good part of a paper on using statistical physics to interpret how they work. And so they modeled a LLM producing certain classes of answers with a statistical model. It's called a Wiener process, and I thought that was great. I was like, anytime you have more jobs for physicists, I generally approve. It's like, but I think the models have gotten so large and so complex. You have Anthropic really working on being able to explicitly model, what is it thinking, and they call them like circuits is the work that they've been promoting lately. So this is a very different approach where you look at kind of diffusive processes which don't necessarily have semantic meaning at every step, and they were able to find what they thought was a pretty good simplification of the overall model space, which basically allowed four different modes of there was a very like you could predict 50% of the model output using four different modes. So you could basically use statistical physics to tell if a model had become evil, for instance, was one of their takeaways. It's if you started to prompt it to become like a Kanye style model, it would show up in the statistics of how the answer diffusive space was progressing if you look at the chain of thought. So those are types of interesting things. And I was thinking about my physics friends who have all these models and tools in math, and making sure they have funding and jobs is great. So I like to see that.
A whole nother episode on that topic. With that, I think we will wrap it up there, Matt.
All right. See you soon.
All right. See ya. Bye now.